Susan Taylor wrote this: "I am a glorious being, a miracle. That which is in God is also in me. I survive all the storms of life, and like a tree planted by the water, I shall not be moved." I read to you from Dr. Francis McNabb's book, Messages to the Mind and Spirit. For some, Mother's Day is a day of obligations. People feel they have to be nice, even though, not far away, there may be long-standing resentment, frustration, and sadness. Mothers had the chance to open many doors for their children. In later years, some adult children would really like to close the door on their mother. What went wrong? Why did some hate their mothers? It is not that she becomes too much of a demanding handful in her later years. It is more what happened in the early years. Mothers sometimes loving their children if they did what their mothers wanted only, and did not exercise too much self-assertion. Mothers and fathers sometimes providing so much for their children in the way of food, material comforts, but leaving them in an interpersonal vacuum, not really believing in themselves and not feeling any sense of real worth, self-worth. Now we have a burgeoning population of young people who are depressed and unhappy, and not only have little belief in themselves, but have little belief in a good world. Huge populations of young people are all ready to be angry, violent, and destructive of themselves, of property, and of other people. It is too simple, though, to place all this on the shoulders of the mother or the parenting ones. But unless the parents really and deeply communicate that they love their children and reach out behind their masks and show children that they are important, that they have an inherent worth and great potential, then mothers can expect a present on Mother's Day, but don't ask too many questions. Mothers and fathers can really enjoy their children and wrap their arms around them as their top priority and engage and build their active listening to their child. Then Mother's Day will be far more than just an observed obligation. It is not too late. It is never too late to develop new ways of being in the world and different interpersonal skills that tell a child, you are accepted and blessed. Hello everybody, speaking to you from Coburg Uniting Church, where we bring together psychology and spirituality in service to the human soul. May is, our theme is soul, suffering, and healing within families. And this is the month of preventing domestic violence and abuse. The research tells us that the main cause of homelessness is domestic violence and abuse. We are stewards of this time and place. We can make a difference and be messengers of a different way of being and preventing domestic violence. So we're doing our little bit of Coburg Uniting to celebrate mothers on this Mother's Day and to look at healing within families. Our focus today particularly is the gift of active listening to cure by listening actively to one another and to our children, to help youngsters with an unkind world. And if you look at that theologically, spiritually, if you can do active listening to a child's feelings, it's like you're saying to them, you are acceptable and you are accepted and received by something greater than yourself, especially when you feel unacceptable. So when all the doors of institutions might be closed to you as a person, this door to my heart is not closed, and God has placed before you an open door that no one can shut, and you are loved and accepted unconditionally. That's what active listening can do, the gift of time and listening to a child. So let's talk about that today. Welcome. I wanted to start with a bit of self-disclosure, a personal story for Mother's Day. This is a tale of two mothers. I'm very fortunate that I've had two mothers in my life. I was an adopted child. I was adopted by my mom and dad, my adopted parents, when I was about 4 weeks old. And so I want to take you back before that story, though, to 1966, time in Northern California, where there was a young woman who was in secondary school, high school, in California, and she fell pregnant. The rest of the story is traumatic, and it's a story that I remember every Mother's Day and every day of my life, of a real hero who was my birth mother. She fell pregnant, and unfortunately, she was then cast into exile, as it were. She had to move from her family home and live with her aunt about an hour north in a town in Northern California, an hour north of the Bay Area, and that's where she cared for this baby inside of her for 9 months and eventually gave birth. There was a lot of dead weight pressure on this teenage girl to have an abortion, but she said, that ain't happening. I'm not going to do that. She wanted to keep the child, but because of her circumstances and her young age, she couldn't. This amazing aunt, who was a nurse, looked after that young mother, and it was a traumatic time for her. That mother was my mother, and I think of her as a serious hero. She was able to, even when she was in her teen years, able to stand on her own 2 feet and to find the support that she needed, and to realize that no, I'm not going to listen to some people who want me to end this pregnancy. The rest of the story is amazing, that I've been able to reconnect with her in recent times, and to say how much she means to me, and she's like a sacrament of grace. That's one element of the hero's journey, of the mother, of the heroic journey of giving birth, of nurturing something in your own body. It's been said that men only enter history, but women are history, and are the structure and the ground of God's creation, the ground of all being. The other hero in my life is my other mother, the one who adopted me. Main reason being, she had to put up with all of my nonsense and my carrying on for 18 years when I lived at home. She raised me, she set boundaries, and she, like my father, provided me with that love and that active listening that I needed to try to grow up and to have some self-belief and some sense of self-worth. I hope you will have that from your mothers. I also join with you who feel perhaps you long for what could have been and what should have been from your mother or your father. And so our energy of this church and our prayers are with you as well, those who grieve what could have been. Last week we talked about soul suffering and healing within families. We made the point that intimate connection with another first requires a solid connection with yourself and what that core identity means. Are you a centered self or just self-centered? We also looked at the nature and the quality of the best intimacy. And we talked about covenant relationships as being where you pledge to another human being your mind, body, and soul to care for their well-being. And you do so as absolute equals. And of course, the wedding vows are based on that. That introduces really the first paradox we're going to talk about today, which is, although in the best form of intimacy, we pledge ourselves to the other. That is, we take their growth as a human being, emotionally, spiritually, at least as important as our own. We don't live at their expense. That's what we say. But the paradox is that you can't save another person unless they're prepared to save themselves. It's a mountain that only you as an individual can climb. And we can help each other in that regard. But there are times when there are great spaces in our togetherness. There are times when we're not always loved the way we want to be loved. And so that paradox of pledging ourselves to care for each other's well-being over and against how an individual must do that themselves introduces the challenge of how will you stand on your own 2 feet in relationship. In a word, differentiation. Differentiate or die spiritually. To differentiate means to maintain a sense of yourself while in relation to others. To claim your sense of self in the presence of others. To not knuckle under your anxiety or the demands and temper tantrums of other people, but to hold fast to your sense of self and your interpersonal boundaries. Now, if you've grown up in a dysfunctional family, that's difficult to do. Within what's been called a dysfunctional family system, often one member of the family lives at the expense of other members of that family. They do not regard the other family members' growth as important as their own. And other family members are sometimes fit into roles not of their own choosing, like the family clown, or the family member who's always causing problems for everyone else in the family. Sometimes these myths and these beliefs about families go unchallenged, and so the toxic, untrue story, the mythology of the family continues, and it goes unchallenged. Also in those types of families, a person's growth is always stunted, so they're not allowed to feel what they feel. So it can be very difficult to differentiate when that is your background and that is your daily bread. But to differentiate is to self-validate, it's to transcend the reflected sense of self. That is, you do exist, not just in the eyes of others, but you have a core sense of self. If you want to keep intimacy alive, your level of differentiation must keep pace with your partner's increasing importance to you. So the closer you grow to another human being, the more that you must differentiate, to become self-soothing and self-challenging, to find those threads of your self-worth and of those stories and people that help you to stand up to your full stature as a human being, which affirm your deepest sense of self, being and both becoming. Now, in relationships where we don't value the other's growth, at least as important as our own, now love your neighbor as much as you love yourself, Jesus said, we can then become sort of attached in a codependent way to others, and it's like we don't exist even in our own eyes unless we are validated by another. Christian spirituality is those moments, those stories, those experiences, finding all of those and weaving them together so that our sense of self-worth, sense of self will be strong. And then we have the whole world to give others when we live an authentic life. In helping people to stand up to their full stature, to survive dysfunctional families, and to become an authority for their own life, Jesus helped people to do this by not talking, not trying to tell people how the world was, but by active listening. When you analyze the New Testament, the stories about Jesus, it's as if he gave a person back to themselves and liberated them from themselves, from the scared, angry part of themselves, they were liberated. And he returned them back to the better angels of their nature. He did it by active listening. Throughout the scriptures, Jesus used an incredible rabbinic method where you get to the truth of a matter by asking deeper questions. For example, when he asked the paralytic at the pool, "Do you want to be made well? Pick up your mat and walk." He asked Peter, "Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am?" And he would often ask others, like the leading scribes and Pharisees, whose inscription is on this coin? And of course, it was Caesar's, when the question was asked of him of should we pay taxes. So often Jesus would answer a question with a question. I would urge and fight for a more listening Christianity, rather than a Christianity that is constantly imposing its morality onto others without listening to them. We need to stop talking as Christians and really begin listening actively and deeply. Steve Biddulph, the great psychologist, said this: human beings go into competition when they do not feel loved. What's that about? It's about when we can't relax into the moment, when we feel like we have to keep fighting for love and acceptance from our parents or our caregivers. That's when we go into competition, because we don't feel we can relax into or trust the love of another. And therefore, rather than cooperating with others as we get older, we compete. We compete for that longed for affection. We compete for that acceptance and for that sense of affirmation that goes to the deepest parts of our soul. But through a key tool like active listening, we feel that grace that each of us deserves, that should be part of our inheritance and our birthright. So I want to talk for a moment to wrap up about active listening. Many of these insights come from Steve Biddulph's book, Raising Happy Children. And it's probably learning points that you already know, but worth remembering. Biddulph makes the point that the door to life's possibilities and to your relationship with your child or your spouse can be opened by active listening, or the walls can go up forever. He says there are three main types of reactions in which the walls go up between you and another human being. The first that he mentions is, I'll mention all three of them: patronizing, lecturing, and distracting. And I challenge myself in this, as I do all people, that I know there are times when I've done these things. So the way to create greater trust, Biddulph argues, and I have seen in my experience, is asking a child about how they feel and not trying to solve the problem for them. And that's a tough temptation for me. I know in my own life with my children there have been times when I have lectured them, and Biddulph gives this example of lecturing, what it is. Well, so your child comes to you with a problem at school. Well, you are stupid to have gotten into this mess, so I'll tell you what you should do, what I want you to do. Now listen carefully to me. That's an example of lecturing. And then there's, secondly, distracting a child from their feelings. For example, oh, well, never mind. Let's go and play cricket. Or would you like some chocolate? Distracting. And finally, patronizing. Oh, you poor thing. Here, let me fix the problem for you. I ask myself, which is my style? Which is your style? Do you rush to rescue, or give wise advice, or change the subject? Those are three styles that Bidulph writes about. But then he puts forward this possibility of active listening. I would argue it was the way of the great spiritual teachers of all time, like Jesus of Nazareth. So it's asking questions such as, you look really unhappy. What went wrong? You're worried you won't be able to keep up. What did you do in that situation when you got in a fight on the playground? How did you feel about that happening? Questions like that. It's really asking, do you have the courage to not rush in and solve the problem for the child, but to listen to how it affected them and what they're feeling? If we can hold back from putting instant band-aids on every hurt, we can enter the deeper world of our children, and we can show them the grace and the power and the energy that says you are accepted, even when you feel unacceptable. It's a simple thing, active listening. I'm still learning to do it. I hope that on this Mother's Day, you will develop your interpersonal skills based on the excellent skills and spiritual qualities that you already possess. From all of us here at Coburg Uniting Church, we wish you a very happy Mother's Day. Next time, we will be continuing our series next Sunday on soul suffering and healing within families, and looking at some of the things that healthy families do to develop a healthy narrative, and what are the interactions and the relationships in healthy families. Thanks for joining us. All the best.